Video game movies. They're something that's often attempted, but rarely do they ever pan out. And sadly, when they do manage to cross the finish line, the product we're given is frequently nothing to write home about. Today, I want to dive into this topic a little bit and take a look at the past, present, and future of video game adaptations. As of me recording this, I've counted about 379 video game adaptations that come in one form or another. Everything from live-action movies to animated direct-to-video features. That's a number so high that I'm sure I got it wrong, so don't fact-check me on that. The point is, there have been a lot of them. A lot more than I would have guessed, too. This was pretty shocking to me, because if I were asked to name a few, I'd likely struggle with naming even 10 of them, because that's the kind of impression most of these movies have left on me. And that's no impression at all. Now, I'm far from an expert in this category. I haven't seen all of these, not even close. However, I've seen a lot of them, but I doubt I could give you an exact number. And I do have a background in television production, as it is what I do for a living, outside of making these wildly successful YouTube videos. As I said earlier, there are just far too many of these to cover all of them, so I'm really going to be mostly focusing on worldwide theatrical releases to sort of trim the numbers down, and I'm really only going to be going in depth to any of them that are noteworthy, be they good or bad. But I also just want to touch on some that are near and dear to my heart because, well, this is my video and I'm gonna do what I want. Most people, and I include myself in that bunch, assume that the first video game movie was the infamous 1993 Super Mario Bros. But in actuality, the first video game movie was a completely different Mario movie that came out a whole 7 years earlier. That movie? 1986's Super Mario Bros. Peach-hime Kyushatsu Dai Sakusen, or The Great Mission to Rescue Princess Peach. While in today's standards, this movie is far from anything award-worthy, it's still pretty entertaining. Everything you need to know basically is right there in the title. The Mario Brothers go and rescue Princess Peach from Bowser, just like in the games. It's not just a better movie than the live-action Mario, it's also a much better adaptation too. I mean, just look at these two images side by side. Which of these movies would you rather see? It's honestly a shame that filmmakers in the years to come didn't look to this movie on how to adapt a video game franchise. Instead, it would seem filmmakers would look to the live-action adaptation of Mario for inspiration on how to convert video game to film, despite it being both widely disliked and a complete box office failure. Video game movies are often critiqued for how far they stray from their source material, and had people just looked to this charming little animated one instead, the future from this point could have been a little brighter. Now, it's not like the films we're going to talk about from this point forward are terrible. It's like that saying goes, those who don't know their past are doomed to repeat it. Because we're going to see this issue come up quite a bit, where the movie just gets rid of everything that made the game popular. The next few years continue in a somewhat similar fashion as this. Video game movies that come out of Japan end up being pretty decent films, and pretty good adaptations of the source material as well, with movies like Fatal Fury the motion picture, and Street Fighter II the animated movie. While over in North America, we got the live-action Street Fighter and Double Dragon movies. Which, you tried, I guess. You got that going for you. But following those two movies up, we got back-to-back Mortal Kombat movies, which, sure, critically they were both pretty poorly received, the sequel much more so than the original. But for me, and audiences, we mostly loved them. They were corny, but they were fun. For me personally, as far as the North American movies go, Mortal Kombat is, in a way, what adaptations should shoot for, and I can't believe I'm saying that. Sure, the acting is corny, and a lot of the effects were a little dated even for the time. For the most part, it was a good adaptation of the game itself. I think what helped Mortal Kombat out was that at the time, the game series wasn't exactly rich in lore or character development like it is today. So, with that, the movie had a lot more wiggle room to do with whatever they wished. Now, each character in the movie is for the most part identifiable as its video game counterpart, and there was a tournament in the movie. There really wasn't much more to it than that. But the game didn't have much either. Now, there is one more important piece to this movie and why I think it was as successful as it was, but I'll talk about that when it's a little more applicable, and it has to do with the director of the movie. 1999 brought us Wing Commander. Wait, Wing Commander? Really? This Wing Commander? Why? Sure, the games were pretty popular at one point, but I doubt even the fans were clamoring for a movie of this one. What this movie did right, though, is almost the exact same thing as what it did wrong. It's the only reason I want to talk about it. This movie is directed by Chris Roberts, who is the creator of the video game series as well. Something that I feel is incredibly important when adapting a video game to movie is having the original creator involved. They know the source material better than you ever will, and they know what the fans like about the series and possibly what they would want to see out of a movie. The problem here is he had all of the control, not just some respected input. Chris Roberts is undoubtedly a talented game creator. He's made a ton of them. Sadly, that doesn't make you a talented film director, and that's exactly what went wrong with this movie. It's not rocket science. To make a competent movie, you need a competent director. It makes me sad because there are enough decent ideas in this movie that if Chris were to have handed it off to a much more experienced director and sort of kept him in line with the Wing Commander brand, this could have been a fantastic movie. The next 4 years would mark the beginning of an era of video game movies. Between 2001 and 2003 specifically, we saw the beginning of what most people know of video game movies. First, we had the two Tomb Raider movies, Tomb Raider and Tomb Raider Cradle of Life. While technically something came between those two, ignore that for now, we'll get back to it. Both Tomb Raider films are pretty equal in quality, and while they're good enough adaptations, they weren't great movies, at least not critically. Personally, I thought they were fine. The important thing with these two movies is more of a credit to the game series, but I think some of it does extend to the film. The early 2000s gaming scene was widely seen still as a boys' hobby. So for Paramount Pictures to pick this property, making it the first of still only a select few female-led video game movies, good on you, Paramount. Coming in to interrupt everything, almost like I forgot to add this movie until the very end and I wasn't going to rewrite it to make it fit better, is everyone's favorite Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. A movie that isn't based on any of the games, really borrow much of anything from the series, it just shares the name. But I guess there is a character named Sid, so that makes it a Final Fantasy property. Now, I'll have to admit some personal bias with this movie. I don't like it. However, I can't ignore this movie's accomplishments, despite how bizarre some of them are. On a technical level, for 2001, keep in mind, this movie is visually a masterpiece. At the time, it would have blown your face through the back of your head. The more odd achievements with this movie come in with the main character, Aki Ross. in that she was one of the first characters planned to be a digital actress, meaning despite not being a real person, her character model would star in a variety of films. It was a dumb idea, and I'm glad they abandoned it. But even more peculiar is that Aki Ross was voted one of the world's sexiest women in 2001 by Maxim magazine. She even graced the cover of that issue in a bikini. A move today, a whole 17 years later, I'm still confused by. Earlier I mentioned something coming between the two Tomb Raider movies. I'm sure some of you will know what I'm talking about given the timeline of this video, but if not, it's the movie that started it all. If all in this case is 6 movies starring Mila Jovovich. The movie I'm talking about, 2001's Resident Evil. While this is a movie series that spans 15 years, I'm just going to bundle them all together and talk about them all now instead of going back to a Resident Evil movie every few minutes in this video. I'm sure you'll appreciate it. To be blunt, many people, especially the critics, would say the Resident Evil films are not good. I mean, they average a 39% on Metacritic, but somehow they've still managed to make 6 of them. That's an achievement that most film series don't hit, let alone when you're based off a video game franchise. So obviously they're doing something right here. Without a doubt, a huge reason to this series' success is writer/director Paul W.S. Anderson, a man whose name we're gonna hear a lot throughout this series. He was the man in charge of all 6 of these Resident Evil movies. That's unheard of. Every film series that runs even half this long can never seem to secure the same writer or director for the entire series. Now, part of this is probably to do with the star of the films is Mila Jovovich, the director's wife. But also, the man had some previous experience with adapting a video game, as he was, and this was unknown to me until I started writing this, he was the director of the first Mortal Kombat film. So he's been here before. Despite the film's critical failings, I have no issue saying that I've been a fan of these films for a long time. They just scratch an itch, and I think that's why they've stuck around as long as they have. While they're pretty poor adaptations of any of the games themselves, the series had a really fun way of nitpicking through different elements from each of the games to form their own unique product. This way, it wasn't alienating anyone unfamiliar with the series, and if you were a fan of the games, you could go in and have fun seeing what things they chose for certain characters and creatures. These movies basically only each made enough money to fund the next one in the series, which in a way is great. They carved out their own little niche and ran with it. Without a doubt, these movies are sort of a bar to hit for video game adaptations in my opinion. Sure, they can definitely improve from these, but I feel like they're a really solid guideline to start with when you're adapting a video game. Now, with Resident Evil out of the way, we swing all the way back to 2003's House of the Dead, and the beginning of another staple in video game film adaptations. This man, to anyone familiar enough with video game movies, needs no introduction. The infamous director, Uwe Boll. This man has been responsible for 11 different films based off video games, all of which have honestly been terrible. And that's not just my opinion. I'm not sure any of these have received reviews in the double digits. Yeah, they're that bad. Now, let me quickly run through all of the films he's brought to us. House of the Dead, Alone in the Dark 2, Blood Rain 2, Blood Rain 3, In the Name of the King, In the Name of the King 2, In the Name of the King 3, Postal, and Far Cry. He's been a very busy man. One movie of note here is Postal, which earned an amazingly low $146,000 at the box office. The Oogie Loves in the Big Balloon Adventure managed to at least cross 1 million, and I bet you've never heard of that movie. Then again, you probably didn't know Postal existed either. Now, I don't want this video to be all about Uwe Boll. There are piles of articles on this man if you want more details, but to sum up the issue with each of these films, it's just gross incompetence. If you're not a good director, you're not going to make a good film. It's really that simple. The one credit I will give to him is he doesn't give up, and he clearly loves making video game movies. Despite a constant stream of negative reviews, one movie after another, he kept making them. And I applaud that. Now, we rewind back in time when we had yet realized that we all loved Dwayne Johnson with 2005's Doom, a movie that rides the line between passably generic and bad. But don't just take my word for it. The Rock himself called this movie a stinker, and, well, we all have to take his word for it. Dwayne would never lie to us. However, the one thing about this movie is it was the first and still one of the only few films to ever feature a first-person perspective. At least for an extended period of time, and not just a quick POV shot. Sure, we've seen a few movies recently do it, but you always gotta credit the first. 2006 brought two very different movies to us. I'm not sure you can get much more opposite than Silent Hill and Dead or Alive. And if you don't know anything about either of these series, from the names alone you might mistake which of these is a horror property and which of these is essentially about four girls becoming friends. Starting with Silent Hill, it's no different than most of these movies we've talked about. It's okay, but personally it's easily one of my favorites. It's not exactly an adaptation of any of the games, but the movie still manages to feel like an unreleased Silent Hill game come to life. On top of this, it's easily the most visually interesting movie of any of them we're going to talk about. It's beautifully shot, and the way they hired dancers to weirdly contort themselves as the nurses is just... it's beautiful. While this movie might be a little on the long side, the plot is pretty interesting, and I definitely say if you're going to watch any movie off this list, please watch Silent Hill. Sadly, I can't speak these praises for the 2012 sequel, Silent Hill Revelation, starring
Jon Snow.
This movie, while it did one good thing, it trimmed the running time down a bit. It also slashed the budget by about 60% and lost most of what made the original visually interesting. Add that to a story that's so convoluted and boring that it took me 4 different times to not fall asleep during this movie, and you've got yourself a product that's honestly worth skipping over. Now back to Dead or Alive, this movie is just fun. It shockingly follows the plot of the games pretty well, has non-stop, pretty well choreographed fight scenes, and some fun nods to the game series for the fans. However, like most of these films, it also suffered from pretty poor dialogue and acting, and that's more than likely what caused this movie to be a flop, earning less than $8 million at the box office, making it one of the least financially successful films on this list, despite, for me, it being one of the better movies here. Coming off the success of a quadrilogy of games, we get the first Hitman movie in 2007 with the excitingly named Hitman, a name so bland that I'm truly shocked anyone would go to see this. What's fascinating about this movie is that the casting began in January of the same year, meaning the film was released a mere 11 months later. I don't believe I've heard of a turnout that quickly, especially for a movie with a multi-million-dollar budget. Also, a fun fact about this movie, it was almost done entirely in the editing, as allegedly the original product that the director delivered was filled with extreme violence, and that all had to go. Next up, we've got Max Payne, coming out at an odd time, 5 years after the most recent game release, and 4 years before the next one would come out. So, by this point in 2008, when the film finally released, interest was essentially as low as it could be. While this movie certainly had some interesting moments, it's a nearly impossible task to get past Mark Wahlberg's acting, which it's probably the worst he's ever done in this movie. So bad, in fact, that it even earned him a Razzie nomination later that year. Despite the reception of the first Street Fighter movie, a whole 15 years later, someone thought it would be a great idea to tackle another one. This one focusing specifically on Chun-Li, in Street Fighter: The Legend of Chun-Li. Not only was the first attempt a complete failure, this movie, they combined that movie's shortcomings. Director Andrzej Bartkowiak. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I speak very poor Polish. Anyways, he was the man that directed Doom, the one we've already talked about. So it wasn't exactly a surprise that this movie didn't turn out amazing. I will say I'm a pretty big fan of the casting of Michael Clarke Duncan as Balrog, though. I thought that was pretty good. Now, I truly am sorry for being as negative as I have been up to this point. It wasn't exactly my intention, but it's just how I felt. But let's swing things around in the positive direction, because I want to talk about my favorite video game movie, Prince of Persia and the Sands of Time. While not without its fair share of issues, and completely butchering the plot of the games the film is based on, the Prince of Persia film manages to be genuinely entertaining and fairly well crafted, which shouldn't come off as a complete surprise, as it was directed by Mike Newell, the man who directed possibly my favorite of the Harry Potter films, The Goblet of Fire. Also, the movie was written by the creator of the game franchise, Jordan Mechner. Add an ostrich race to that and you've got yourself a nice hot cup of success soup. Like I had mentioned earlier, I do believe it's key to involve the original creator, and very much unlike Wing Commander, this movie proves you need more than just that to be a success. Both Disney and Jerry Bruckheimer were hoping this could be one of their new flagship franchises, the next Pirates of the Caribbean, if you will. Sadly, with this film's mostly lukewarm reception by critics, and it having been almost 8 years and we haven't even heard whispers of a second film, it would seem they've abandoned that idea entirely. And it's a shame. This movie definitely had room to grow, and they had already started with a great foundation. Unfortunately, when you finish with the best movie on the list, you can go nowhere but down. And we go from what might be the best straight to the bottom of the barrel with 2010's release of Tekken. Easily the most forgettable film on this list. Debatably one of the most forgettable movies of all time. It's undoubtedly deserving of its 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. Harada himself, the creator of the game series, has called this movie terrible. And even looking at pictures of this man's face today, it's clear the man never really got over what they did to his baby. 2014 brought us the Need for Speed movie, directed by Jordan Waugh, a man who shares a name with the sound you make when you hear they're making a Need for Speed movie. This movie didn't exactly hide what it was doing, as it was less a film in more a really complicated 2-hour-long commercial for the 2015 Ford Mustang. This movie is just silly, but it's sort of the right kind of silly. It has things like characters named Dino Brewster, which I don't know why, that name just really makes me laugh. And I think my favorite part is, minor spoilers here, there's a scene in which Aaron Paul's character drives the previously mentioned Mustang at 234 miles per hour, or 376 kilometers for you Canadian folk. A speed so ridiculously fast that I can assure you that car would rip apart. So while critically mostly bland and forgettable, it's a fun popcorn flick if nothing else. But it sadly exists in a world where Fast and Furious also exists, and they just do this formula better. Now, do you remember earlier when I said Hitman was only the first Hitman movie? Well, in 2015, they decided to take another crack at it and reboot it with Hitman Agent 47, which took the same boring name of the original and somehow made it worse. Unfortunately, with this movie, they handed it off to a much less experienced director than from the first one, and a much less experienced and well-known actor to play the star. By all accounts, while not bad, wasn't quite as good as the first attempt a few years prior. I don't think I'd be alone in saying that the Hitman franchise, while reasonably popular games, they're just a little too generic when converted to film. So it's not exactly the film's fault in my opinion. Now, Hitman Agent 47 does have one interesting thing going for it, and that's later that year, Adrian Askria, the producer of the movie, said that he may be overseeing a film universe starting with this movie, with other movies based off Just Cause, Deus Ex, Thief, and Tomb Raider to come in the future. Now, there has been somewhat of an update to this shared universe, and because this video is being made post the release of Tomb Raider, we'll touch on more about that when we catch up to Tomb Raider. 2016 was the year video game movies tried to take charge, releasing a whopping 12 movies based off video game properties that year alone. But I'm only going to be talking about the ones that had international theatrical releases, which cuts that number down to 5. Which is still a lot, so I'm sorry, but I'm not the person who made them, I'm just the guy who decided to talk about them. We start off with a 1, 2, 3.5 punch with several back-to-back animated films, each of which had wildly different levels of success. In April, we got the Ratchet & Clank film, something that I was personally looking forward to, as the cartoony style of the game would play incredibly well to an animated feature. While by no means a terrible movie, in a world where Disney and Pixar essentially have their grip on that entire market, it's nearly impossible to break through. With the games not being super hot with the kids at that time like they were back in the PS2 era, the movie just didn't have the marketing push it needed to, probably due to its budget being about 10% of what the big league animated movies have. Luckily for fans of the games, that same month we got a remake/reimagining of the original game, and that game is fantastic. Now, a game that was hot with the kids and a hit at the box office when the movie was released in May of 2016 was the Angry Birds movie. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the best segue I have ever and will ever write. The Angry Birds movie, to put it bluntly, did the impossible. A relatively unknown studio, seeing as all they've been attached to is various Angry Birds projects, making a movie based off a video game, getting a handful of good reviews, and earning money on top of that? How did they do it? To put it simply, they managed to get the movie out at the perfect time, while the games were still hot. Definitely past their peak, but by this point certainly still fresh in everyone's mind. When making a film based off an existing property, timing is also important. Now, on to the highest grossing movie based off a video game, we have Warcraft. A movie which beat out previous record holder Prince of Persia by a cool 100 million. You might ask yourself, Colin, if this movie made over $430 million, it must have done something right. And you'd be right, it did. But just because you made bank doesn't mean you made a good movie. From what I've gathered from my experience viewing the movie and talking to fans of Warcraft, it seems like this was more of a movie made for the fans, which is a great thing for the production companies because luckily for them, there are millions of Warcraft fans to go see this movie. The director, Duncan Jones, is a talented director and an admitted fan of the games. Personally, I'm someone who says you can feel passion in a movie. There's just a difference between when something was made from the heart and when you're just trying to make a buck. And I do get that feeling from this movie. The main issues with this movie start to arise when you aren't exactly a fan of the source material. I'm an outsider, and I'm not sure there was ever more than a 3-minute stretch that I could follow. Warcraft does raise an interesting question though. Do you make a movie for the fans or for the critics? Because while not impossible, it's going to take something really special to do both. And 9 times out of 10, I think you're usually better off picking one or the other, or you will likely end up with something that neither party likes. Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV is the only movie on this list that's less an adaptation and more of a tie-in, as it runs parallel to the story of the game. Much like the other Final Fantasy films, this film is absolutely gorgeous. Without a doubt, setting the bar incredibly high for this style of CG movie. But much like Spirits Within, it's just not very good. As a fan of Final Fantasy XV, I was really looking forward to this film, but the movie throws out basically every lovable character from the game and replaces them with Nyx, a man forced to star in a Final Fantasy movie after his My Chemical Romance cover band didn't quite pan out. On paper, this movie should have worked, an all-star cast working with the creators of the game and even being written by the writer of the game too. There's nothing in particular that stands out as a glaring issue with this movie. So I can't exactly say what went wrong. Maybe it was just everyone was mentally checked out for the production. And as someone who's dealt with it himself, I get it. It happens. But the result in this case was just nearly 2 hours of an absolutely confusing plotline. Assassin's Creed had the ingredients for a fantastic movie. A talented director, an all-star cast, a well-timed release, and even being based off a hugely popular video game franchise, and working with the team of people who made them. To anyone who saw the movie, we all know that sometimes the perfect ingredients don't exactly make the perfect pie. Well, actually they do. That was a really terrible metaphor, but I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. Assassin's Creed wasn't a perfect film. While well acted and beautifully shot, like so many of these other movies, it falls apart in the writing department, leaving anyone unfamiliar with the game standing in a generic puddle of confusion, and leaving fans of the series with even more questions, seeing as the movie is said to take place in the same universe as the games, but abandons and changes so many things throughout the series. I would be incredibly interested to talk to someone who'd never played or really knows anything about the games to see what they think of the movies. Because I don't think this one was bad. But unfortunately for me personally, who has played so many of the games, it's really hard for me to sever the tie of game knowledge and movie knowledge. Remember a few minutes ago when I was talking about a video game cinematic universe? Well, basically everyone, myself included, forgot that was said, but with the 2018 release of the Tomb Raider reboot, word of that cinematic universe are still floating around. However, still nothing has been officially said whether they're continuing with that or not. If this Tomb Raider film is any sign of the quality for the future films, I believe things are finally headed in the right direction. While the movie is a little on the generic side, this Tomb Raider movie was fun. It seemed to focus more on being a stable movie first and being based off a video game second, not constantly throwing in references to like, hey, look, gamers, you know this. Real movies don't have that kind of thing, and this movie, for the most part, got rid of them. It sounds like it should be common sense to do this, but after every movie we've gone through, it clearly isn't. It's not just me who thought this, it's the highest rated video game movie of all time. Or, at least it was for about a month, because on April 13th, Rampage was released. Starring everyone's favorite muscle man, a gorilla named George, this movie was destined for success. Oh, and Dwayne Johnson was in it too. That probably helped. Destruction, giant monsters, and The Rock. A tasty recipe for a great summer movie, and that's exactly what this achieved. It wasn't trying to be artsy or nab itself an Oscar, it was just trying to be 107 minutes of fun. If your source material is silly, don't turn it into Citizen Kane. Just have fun with it. While I do like me some serious films from time and again, there's a lot of mindless games out there that would make a great popcorn flick. And this shows that it can be done with basically any source material. Because before this movie, how many people remembered the Rampage games? And now, it is the highest rated video game movie of all time. And frankly, I would say it deserves it. Now, looking back at all of this video comes off way more negative than I had ever intended. That wasn't exactly the goal of this video, to tear everything apart. The truth is just that I care about video games, and I care about movies. Despite how I may have come across throughout all of this, I just wanted to say I'm critical because I care. So many of these movies, to me, feel more like an attempt at a cash grab, instead of paying respect to a video game property. Now, do I personally hate all of these movies that I've talked about? No, not at all. I mean, I had mentioned a few that I like, and to be honest, outside of a few here and there, most of these are watchable. They're just poor adaptations, or they're something I wouldn't really recommend to someone. Wow, that was a lot of talking. A lot more than I expected when I first started writing this, honestly. What can I say? The history of video game movies is interesting to me, and I've learned quite a bit during the research of this video, and I hope you learned something too, I guess. I want nothing more than all of these movies to do well. And while I've only ever made a student short film, I understand it's no easy task to make a movie. There is so much that can and likely will go wrong in production. My hope is anyone making a movie based off of a video game looks to the past and sees what the others have done and learn from the mistakes and their successes. The highest rated video game movie still is only a 51% on Rotten Tomatoes. There's a lot of room to grow. With countless films on the horizon, I have no doubt they will continue to get better. Curious to see what those movies are? or which I personally think will see the light of day, stick around, because there is a part 2 coming to this, where I will look into the movies that are currently in production. And I'll do my best to speculate which are already off on the right foot, and which are sort of sitting in a development nightmare. I think what I'm trying to say with this video is, because I've spent so long pointing out the goods and the bads of video game movies from the past, if in the future we get a really good video game movie, I'm gonna give myself some credit.